Welcome back to another episode of Analyzing the Apocalypse. We are picking back up in Revelation, and we are in the 8th chapter of this book, continuing to discuss the unfolding message of this book and what it's communicating to us concerning a lot of important truths, especially around the sovereign reign of God, how he views his people, and what he does to evil nations. We're going to see more of that same theme in this topic today in Revelation chapter 8. We're going to go ahead, like we have been, and just read the chapter for what it is. The entirety of the 8th chapter is only 13 verses, so it won't take us too long to read this, and then we'll have a conversation about the details of the text and try to piece it all together as we go. So I'm going to invite you to open your Bibles to Revelation chapter 8, and let's begin with reading in verse 1, and like I said, we'll read to the end of the chapter. When he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. Then another angel, having a golden censer, came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense, with the prayers of the saints, ascended before God from the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it to the earth. And there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. So the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. The first angel sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth. And a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. Then the second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. And a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the water because it was made bitter. Then the fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them were darkened. A third of the day did not shine, and likewise the night. And I looked, and I heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the remaining blast of the trumpet of the 3 angels who are about to sound. So once again, we're seeing a lot of imagery in Revelation. We went in prepared for this. We know what to expect. We understand that there's a lot of symbolism here. But what does it all mean? To really understand where we're at in chapter 8, we have to look at this also and see what we've talked about up to this point. So we have seen up to this point in Revelation, we go back to chapter 6 and we go back to chapter 7 for that matter, but mostly chapter 6. We have there the 7 seals that are introduced to us, and 6 of those 7 seals are opened. And then, of course, in the last chapter, chapter 7, there's a bit of an intermission meant to provide comfort. And then in chapter 8, you have the final seal that is unveiled. So in all these things, we're seeing a progression, is the point that I'm getting at. And that's what you're seeing in the first part of chapter 8 here is that progression, where when the 7th seal is opened, the reader might expect that this is going to be it, that this is as bad as it's going to be final, it's going to be conclusive, that's the end of the story. But it's actually not. The opening of the 7th seal, once again, I'll draw your attention back to the first couple of verses, it reveals something else. It reveals harsher judgments that are coming. And it shows that it's not over yet. It's only going to intensify and worsen. And that's the idea that we're going to find as we continue on through Revelation, because the 7 seals were just the beginning of that. Now we're on to the 7 trumpets, and they serve a very similar purpose to the 7 seals in that they're revealing God's judgment against the earth, specifically for the sins of the nation of the Roman Empire and for what they had been doing, since we're going to see a lot of details that start to match up against that. So to that point, let's get over to our slideshow and talk about some more details regarding some of the background of this. So for one thing, why would God choose to use trumpets in this particular case? What does a trumpet symbolize? We think about a trumpet and we might think of a band of ours that might enjoy playing a trumpet and making music with it. So we might associate it more with revelry, maybe more with enjoyment of music. That's not necessarily the case in the ancient world. A trumpet to them would have been very different. It would have had a different sound. It wasn't a musical instrument in the technical sense. What a trumpet represented was a warning. And that warning was often in the case of impending war. It was in the case of a disaster that was unfolding. It was a way to allow a lot of people to hear very quickly that there's a problem unfolding and they need to be alerted to it. And if you look in the Old Testament, you'll find numerous cases where trumpets are depicted in that context of warning and of judgment. So, of course, in Numbers chapter 10, you have the depiction of the trumpets that are actually talked about that are used to direct the movement of the camp of Israel. We're talking about in Numbers chapter 10, of course, the wilderness wandering. So they're out there in the wilderness. The trumpets were meant to help them to signal their movements and to coordinate that. But if you go to Ezekiel chapter 33 or Joel chapter 2, you'll find in those chapters in the Old Testament, the trumpet is a depiction of God's judgment and of his judgment being quite harsh and of the warning that's unfolding as a result of that. So that's where these trumpets come into play and why God would use this type of language to describe judgment that's coming upon the earth. But let's take another step back and think about the first 6 verses of Revelation chapter 8. So here's some interesting details that come out of the first 6 verses in this chapter. So again, remember there were 7 seals, and in verse 1, the seventh seal is opened. So the seals have been completed. That scroll that was unable to be opened and seen before the Lamb, that is Jesus, was able to unveil its message, it has now been fully revealed. And notice when this happens, there's silence in heaven for a half an hour. So for a 30-minute period, there is just utter silence in heaven. Now, 30 minutes might sound like a long time if you're waiting in the doctor's office, but 30 minutes is not a long time in the grand scheme of life, and that's the intent behind the reason it's used here. It's used to depict a short period of time, a short span of time, to let us know that this was brief, but it was meant to precede judgment. And we see that type of use of time in this way if we go back to Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 1. We see there that there is silence before judgment, and God commanding those that are being judged to stay silent before him because of what's coming upon them for their sins. So that's what's taking place in verse 1. That's the first event that we find after that seventh seal is opened. But there's more. There's another event that takes place. In fact, I guess you could say in the second event, there's a few different moving parts, but we'll just say that there's a second event that happens here. And that second event is that there are 7 angels who are now in the scene, and they stand before God. And in verse 2, notice they are given 7 trumpets. So we've got angels that are going to sound trumpets. Remember, angels are messengers of God. They are sending out a warning. Ergo, it's fitting that they would be the ones wielding these trumpets. But there's another angel in verse 3 that has a golden censer. And that golden censer is going to hold incense. And we're actually told in a more direct way of what that incense actually represents here. It's a rare case in Revelation where it tells us exactly what it's talking about. It says that this incense in verse 3 is the prayers of the saints, basically. It does mention there that the angel would offer what he has along with the prayers of the saints. So we're seeing that those two things are put together and they might be distinct, but nevertheless, the point is the incense is going to represent the prayers of the saints in general. And he's going to offer this upon the altar that's before the throne of God being in view here. And so the angel offers that incense. He offers that up to God, and the smoke of that incense comes up before God as a sweet smelling aroma before him. I don't have a specific passage on the screen here, but I would encourage you to look back at the book of Leviticus. You'll find that when the altar is mentioned and when sacrifice is mentioned, you'll find very similar language to this. The language of sacrifice will always have a mention there about how it pleases God and it brings him honor and is a sweet smelling aroma before him, in that it causes him joy and it causes him to respond positively to the people who are offering it. And that's what happens here in these 6 verses. Because then, after the incense aroma reaches God and he responds to it, the angel takes the censer that he has, he fills it with fire from the altar, and he throws it to the earth. And what follows that in verse 5? Noise, thundering, lightning, and earthquake. So all kinds of disasters unfold as a result of this. And we find the 7 angels are then prepared to sound their trumpets. So really in the first 6 verses, what you're seeing are the prayers of the saints that God has heard, and he is responding to that by judging those who had persecuted his people. And that might sound like an obscure way to look at it, but that's really what's being depicted here. And it truly is an important lesson about prayer and the impact that it really has. To show that God does respond to prayer and he will answer our prayers, even if it takes him some time to do it. And even if it's not the way we exactly expect, he will answer those prayers. And the 7 trumpets are the manifestation of that answer. It's not pleasant in general. Judgment is never a pleasant thing, but nevertheless, it is God avenging his people, judging those that persecuted them, and going after a wicked nation that stood condemned because of its sin. So that's the first 6 verses of Revelation chapter 8, kind of establishing what's going to take place with these 7 trumpets. But what do we make of the trumpets themselves? How do we understand what these are talking about? Because really, in the first 4 trumpets that we've read here from verses 7 to verse 13, it seems more obscure. If chapter 6 was not obscure to us, then maybe chapter 8 is. But the same pattern really is unveiling itself. If you look back at chapter 6, whenever a seal is loosed, it's opened, there is judgment that follows it. There are bad things that come out of it. The same thing happens here when these angels sound their trumpets. You've got more disasters, more problems that are unfolding as a result of these angels sounding their trumpets. The first one in verse 7, you have an angel that sounds his trumpet, and you have hail and fire mingled with blood that is thrown to the earth that destroys all the vegetation. You have in the second case, in verses 8 and 9, the second angel sounds his trumpet, and there's this great mountain that's burning like fire. Maybe a volcano is maybe in view here. And that's thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea turns to blood, and then you have these living creatures in the sea that die, and you have a third of the ships that are destroyed. In the third case, in verses 10 through 11, what do we find? A great star, maybe a comet, maybe an asteroid. Doesn't really matter exactly what the detail is there. It doesn't give us enough information to know. But what happens? It falls out of heaven, it's burning like a torch, and it hits the rivers of water and the springs of water. And the name of that star is wormwood. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. And a third of the waters became wormwood, and people are dying because the water has been made bitter. And then finally in verse 12, we have that fourth angel who sounds. A third of the sun is struck, along with a third of the moon and the stars, and they are darkened. At least a third of them are. And so a third of the day doesn't shine, and likewise the night doesn't go forth either. And then in verse 13, as it kind of rounds out the chapter and ends those first four judgments from the trumpets, we have another angel entering the picture. So now we've seen basically six angels so far, maybe nine if you look at it from a different angle. But nevertheless, you have another angel that enters the picture here, pronouncing woes upon the earth because there's still more to come, because it hasn't ended, because it's going to get worse. But what do we make of this? How do we make heads or tails of this? Because this seems to be depicting some specific events that take place, right? That's what it seems like. But once again, I would urge you to pause on that line of thinking and really reflect on what we've already talked about with the six seals, or the seven seals, really. When we talked about Revelation chapter 6, we saw there very similar language. Again, it's different in different ways and has different ways of depicting judgment, but it's still revolving around the same topic of judgment, still talking about God acting against those who have persecuted his people. So they might be different in terms of their purpose, and they might be different in terms of what they accomplish, but the goal overall is the same. I will draw your attention to something that is common between all of these. Did you catch the detail that a third is involved here? So go back to verse 7. A third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. In verse 9, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. And in verse 8, a third of the sea became blood. You have in verse 10, a third of the rivers and the springs of water affected. A third of the waters become wormwood. In the case of verse 12, you have a third of the sun, the moon, and the stars that are affected by this darkness. A third ties all this together. And a third strongly implies this is not a permanent, lasting judgment. This is something temporary, and it's something that has not been completed yet, at least in terms of the context of the book itself. We're not talking about our perspective, but rather the perspective of John, who wrote this book. So from his perspective, looking forward into his future, this would be taking place upon the nation of the Roman Empire, and all these judgments would unfold, and it would impact a third of the world, showing again that it's not perfect, it's not complete yet, but it's building up to something greater. And I'll also mention this as another detail that ties all this together. Remember that in the first six verses, we have there the prayers of the saints being offered up to God, and then he responds by offering up these seven trumpets. That is a significant detail, because that's what leads to all these things in verses 7 on down to verse 13. So really, it's the prayers of God's people and his response to that that causes all this to unfold, and that really establishes what we're talking about here and how we should understand this. So to that point, I want you to think about the 10 plagues that befell Egypt. When you read through verses 7 through 13, think about the 10 plagues that befell Egypt, and think about why the 10 plagues befell Egypt. So if you go all the way back to the book of Exodus and about the first 12 chapters, you'll find out that the Egyptians had become a persecuting power against the Israelites. So prior to that, if you go all the way back to the book of Genesis and the days of Joseph, the Egyptians were friendly with the Israelites prior to them being a nation of people per se, but that's a different story for a different time. But the point is that the Egyptians, as time go on, view the Israelites with suspicion, they view them as an enemy, and they persecute them. They enslave them and cause them to labor in a very burdensome way. And so if we compare what happened then And the 10 plagues that befall Egypt for the sins that they had perpetrated against God's people and for him wanting to get them out of that land, if we compare that to what happens in Revelation chapter 8, you see a lot of similarities. You see in the book of Exodus, with all those 10 plagues, vegetation destroyed through hail, through rain, through a lot of devastation, through a locust swarm that comes in. You have also, although the detail is different, the water turning to blood and people getting sick and dying from drinking it. You have the detail also, and again, it's a little bit different, of these cosmic things that are taking place with the sun and the stars and all of this unfolding, especially in verse 12 of Revelation chapter 8 with the darkness that befalls the land. That is very, very similar to what we find in the book of Exodus, with one of the greatest of the 10 plagues being the darkness that befell the land of Egypt. So if we look back at the 10 plagues and we compare them to what we find in Revelation chapter 8 and we make that connection, we begin to see the purpose is very similar. It's God's judgment against a sinful nation that has chosen to persecute his people. And although in Exodus we have some specific events that take place, I wouldn't necessarily say in Revelation chapter 8 we can draw the same conclusion of saying, well, this specific historical date or this specific historical event is what this is talking about. Because a lot of people, especially in verses 8 and 9 of Revelation chapter 8, they connect that to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the time of about 79 AD. I don't think that's a bad idea to throw out there, but it's not conclusive enough to know for sure. It is similar, but again, we just don't know that with certainty that that's what's in view here, and that would have nevertheless been a past event from the perspective of John, not something that was yet to come in the future. So my point with all this is to say that the commonality between all of these, we cannot identify a specific event that ties all these together, but that's not the point of the text. The point of the text is to show that God is going to bring judgment upon the Roman Empire. He is going to afflict them for their sins and for what they've done against his people. They won't get away with what they've done. And it's going to be harsh. It's going to be difficult, but it's not going to be something they can avoid. There's another commonality I haven't mentioned yet. All these things, in some respect, impact creation. They impact a realm of life that no one can really touch on their own power. We might have the ability to cause a lot of issues in the environment and so forth, but really here you're seeing God exercise his creative work and his authority as creator to do with creation as he sees fit. And so as devastating as these things are, it again fits in the idea that God is the creator and he has all authority in heaven and on earth to do as he pleases with the earth. And in this particular case, he uses it to judge and to condemn those that are in need of that because of the things that they've done against his people. So we're not narrowing these things down to specific events because I don't believe these really speak to specific events that we could really identify in history. But we can say this, that they're all judgments that God brings upon the Roman Empire at different points. And how he is going to do that is maybe not something we're told exactly or what event is explicitly in view, but we know that it is God's judgment upon them for their evil deeds. I told you I was going to mention something about wormwood. I don't have it on the slideshow here, but I did want to talk about that more for just a moment. The idea of wormwood is bitterness. In the Old Testament, wormwood is a symbol of judgment upon sinners. So it only reinforces the ideas we presented up to this point. So although the language here is confusing, although it's scary and it's hard to piece together with exactness what it's talking about, the point is clear. It is God's judgment against a wicked nation for the evil deeds they perpetrated against his people. No different than what happened to Egypt in the time of Moses and the people of Israel and the need for the 10 plagues to unfold. So we're seeing parallels to that. And I believe that gives us the framework to really understand this and to piece it all together in a positive way. But, as verse 13 indicates, there are yet 3 woes to come. We've only seen 4 out of 7 trumpets. It's going to get worse. It's going to get more detailed. And that's also to say that the 7 trumpets are not the only judgment that befall the Roman Empire either. We're going to have the bowl judgments that are coming up very soon. So we're going to continue to see this theme evolve and go into greater detail about what God has planned and how thorough his judgment will be, and all of it coming because of the sinfulness of people who refused to change and did not want to heed his ways. That's all we have to say for right now in Revelation chapter 8. As always, I hope this has been enlightening to you to help understand what this is talking about. And even if there's some details that are still unclear, I hope that this at least helps give a better way to understand these things than some of the things that go around about it. But having said all that, I hope once again this has been helpful to you, and we'll talk again in our next episode. Thank you.